Hello, my name is Miss Jones. I teach elementary school math and welcome to my channel, Miss Math Jones. Today we're going to be working on our Eureka Module 5, Lesson 19 homework. Let's get started. The objective for our homework is to compare fractions and whole numbers on the number line by reasoning about their distance from zero. So we're basically going to be able to tell which number is bigger by how close or how far it is from zero. Number 1 says, place the two fractions on the number line. Circle the fraction with the distance closest to zero. Then compare using greater than, less than, or equal to. All right, so first we need to partition our number line. We're comparing thirds. Both of the fractions are thirds. So we're going to partition our number line into thirds. So that means we need 3 lines, and that third line is going to land on our whole number. Let's go ahead and partition this number line for number 1. So we need 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines, and that third line is on our whole number. Now let's go ahead and box in our whole numbers. 0 is a whole number, and 1 is a whole number. So we've boxed in both of our whole numbers. Now let's go ahead and label our fractions on our number line. So we're going to start with 0, and since we're counting by thirds, then our first fraction on our number line under the number 0 is going to be 0 thirds. And we're on a number line, so we just count up in order. So what number comes after 0 when you're counting? That's right, 1. So the next number would be 1/3. All right, what number comes after 1 when you're counting? 2. So that means the next number on our number line would be 2/3. And what number comes after 2 when you're counting? That's right, 3. So that means the final number on our number line, which should be underneath the whole number 1, should be 3/3. And we can make sure that our whole numbers are correct, because if we divide 3 divided by 3, that equals 1. And if we look at our other whole number of 0, 0 divided by 3 is 0. So we know that all of our fractions are in the correct position. Now, let's go ahead and plot both fractions that are being compared on our number line. So to plot something means you just put a dot or a letter there that shows where that fraction is located on a number line. So let's plot 1/3. We're going to find 1/3. Oh, I see it. And I'm going to put a big dot there. Okay, I just plotted 1/3. The other fraction that we need to plot is the one that we're comparing it to, which is 2/3. Okay, I put a dot on 2/3. Now, I have a dot showing me where 1/3 is and a dot or a plot showing me where 2/3 is. Now, the way you can figure out which fraction is bigger is by the one that's closest to 0. The one that's closest to 0 is the small one, and the one that's farthest away from 0 is the big one. Okay, now, which one is close to 0? Is 1/3 close to 0, or is it farther away from 0? Which one's the closest to 0? Now, if you said 1/3 is close to 0, then you're correct. Now, I want you to write as small as you can close to 0 under 1/3. So that means that 2/3 is far from 0. So, as small as you can, write far from 0 under 2/3. Now, again, the one that's closest to 0 is the smaller fraction. The one that's farthest from 0 is the larger fraction. So that means that 1/3 is less than 2/3, because 1/3 is close to 0. So that means it's the small one. Now, you may want to pause your video to make sure that what I have on my screen matches what you have on your paper. Now let's look at number 2. For number 2, we're comparing 4/6 to 1/6. Well, they're both sixths. So we need to partition our number line into sixths, which means we're going to need 6 lines. And that sixth line is going to land on that whole number. All right, let's start partitioning. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And remember that sixth line shows that we're now on a whole number. Okay, your number line should be partitioned into sixths. And now that it's partitioned into sixths, we're going to box in our whole numbers. So 0 is a whole number and 1 is a whole number. So we're going to box those in. Now we can start labeling the fractions on our number line. So below the number 0, since we're counting by sixths, your first fraction below the number 0 should be 0 sixths. What number comes after 0 when you're counting? That's right, 1. So your next fraction should be 1 sixth. And we keep counting up. So after 1 sixth would be 2 sixths, then 3 sixths, then 4 sixths, then 5 sixths. And after 5 sixths, under the number 1 should be 6 sixths. All right, now we've labeled our number line. Now we need to plot the two fractions that we're comparing. So first fraction I see is 4 sixths. So I'm going to place a dot to plot 4 sixths. So I'm going to go ahead and put a dot right there above 4 sixths. I just plotted 4 sixths. Now I also need to plot or place a dot on 1 sixth. So let's go ahead and plot 1 sixth. So right now, your number line should be partitioned. All of your fractions should be labeled. Your two whole numbers should be boxed in. And you should have a dot above 1 sixth and a dot above 4 sixths. Now, let's look at our comparison. For 4 sixths, look at 4 sixths. Is 4 sixths far from 0 or close to 0? That's right, it is far from 0. And what about 1 sixth? Is 1 sixth far from 0 or is it closer to 0? That's right, it is close to 0. Now we can go ahead and put our symbol in there as far as greater than, less than, or equal to. Now remember, the one that's close to 0 is the smallest one. So that means that 4 sixths is greater than 1 sixth because 4 sixths is far from 0. It's close to 1, which means it's bigger than 1 sixth. Now you may need to pause your video so that you can go ahead and make sure that your paper looks like my screen. Okay, now let's take a look at number 3. For number 3, we're comparing 1/4 and 1/8. So let's go ahead and partition our number line. First, we're going to partition our number line into fourths. Then we're going to partition our number line into eighths. So let's go ahead and partition our number line into fourths. And if you have two different color like crayons, this would be a good time to use them for the partitioning. And I'll show you why. So that way you can see the difference between fourths and eighths. So we're going to partition the top of our number line into fourths. So let's go ahead and do that. And we're going to start right here, okay? So that's our first line. And we're partitioning the top only into fourths. Now for our second line, our third line, and our fourth line. So notice now the top of our number line is partitioned into fourths. Now we're going to partition the bottom of our number line into eighths. So the first line would go here between the 0, right, and the first line of the fourth. So put your first line here. Your second line would go here. Your third line would be about here. Your fourth line would go right about here. Your fifth line would be right about here. Your sixth line would go right there. Your seventh line would be here. And your eighth line would be right about here. So if you need to pause your video right now to make sure that the top of your number line is partitioned into fourths and the bottom is partitioned into eighths, go ahead and do so now. Now that you have your top of your number line partitioned into fourths and the bottom of your number line partitioned into eighths, let's go ahead and label our number line. So we're going to start off, before we label our number line, let's box in our whole numbers. So we're going to box in the 0 and we're going to box in the 1 because those are our whole numbers on our number line. All right, now let's start by labeling our fourths. So we're going to start at 0. And the fraction that would be placed at 0 when we're labeling our fourths is 0 fourths. So you're going to write 0 fourths right there. And make sure you're writing it small and neat. Now, we're on a number line, so we're counting up. So the next fraction would be 1/4. The fraction after that would be 2/4. The fraction after that would be 3/4. And the fraction after that would be 4/4. So now we have the top part of our number line, which is partitioned into fourths, labeled. And you see how I have the fourths in red and the eighths in green? That way you can tell the difference between the fractions. So if you have two different colors, go ahead and make sure that the fourths is in one color and the eighths is in a different color. If you don't, that's okay. But it's a lot easier to see when you have one fraction in one color and the other fraction in a different color. Now let's go ahead and label our eighths, which are at the bottom of our number line. So we're going to start with 0, and the fraction that would be underneath 0 is 0/8. And we're on a number line, so we're counting up. So after 0/8 would be 1/8, then 2/8. After that would be 3/8, then 4/8. After that would be 5/8, then 6/8, then 7/8, and finally 8/8, which is 1/2. Now, if you need to pause your video to make sure that your fractions are correctly labeled, both at the top of your number line, at the bottom of your number line as well, go ahead and pause the video now so that you can make sure that the fractions at the top of your number line and the bottom of your number line are labeled correctly. Okay, now let's go ahead and plot our two fractions that we're comparing. So basically, when you plot something, you're putting a dot there, right? Just to show where it is. So let's plot 1/4. Big old dot right there. Or you could circle it. You could circle it also. I just plotted it. I put a dot there. And let's plot 1/8. All right, now just like we did with numbers 1 and number 2, the fraction that's closest to 0 is the smallest, and the fraction that's furthest away from 0 is the largest. So let's talk about the two fractions that we're comparing. Is 1/4 far from 0 or close to 0? That's right. It is far from 0. And that means that 1/8 is close to 0. Now, you can write far from 0 under 1/4 and close to 0 under 1/8 just to make sure that you're keeping it straight, right, in your head until you get really, really good at doing it, because writing those little notes under those fractions helps you to remember. All right, now, if it's far from 0, it's small. If it's big. If it's close to 0, it's small. If it's far from 0, it's big. If it's close to 0, it's small. Okay, so that means that 1/4 is greater than 1/8. Now, if you need to pause your video right now to make sure that you have everything on your paper so far that I have on my screen, go ahead and do so now. All right, let's move on to number 4. For number 4, we're comparing 4/5 and 4/10. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to partition the top of our number line into fifths and the bottom of our number line into tenths. So we need 5 lines to partition the top into fifths. So let's go ahead and place our 5 lines on the top of our number line. Your first line should be about here, okay? Then your second line, your third line, fourth line, fifth line. So you should have 5 lines like this. And your fifth line should be directly on the line of the whole number, okay? One whole. So make sure you have those 5 lines there. Now that we have the top of our number line partitioned into fifths, now we're going to partition the bottom of our number line into tenths. And using 2 different colors here would be a good idea. So let's go ahead and partition the bottom into fifths. So we're going to place our first line halfway between the 0, right, and the first line of our fifths. We're going to place that second line directly beneath the first line of the fifths. We place our third line halfway between. See that? And then our fourth line should be directly underneath there. Okay, let's go ahead and put our fifth line right here in between those 2 lines, right? And then our sixth line should be directly below the third line of the fifths. Our seventh line should be in between those 2, right? Our eighth line should be directly below the fourth line of the fifths. Line number 9 should be in between, like I did there, so, okay? And the 10th line should be directly above 1 whole. Now, notice that for number 3, we were comparing fourths and eighths. A fourth is half of an eighth, or really an eighth is half of a fourth. Look at those lines. Because remember, the smaller the denominator, the bigger the fraction. The bigger the denominator, the smaller the fraction. And look at number 4. We have fifths and tenths. Tenths are half of fifths. Exactly half. You see that? All right, so I just wanted you to notice that because very soon we'll be talking about equivalent fractions. So just notice that if you were to double a denominator, then you end up with a fraction that's in the same place on a number line. All right, now let's go ahead and finish labeling our number line. So I want you to box in your whole number. So box in the 0 and the 1. So box in your whole numbers. Then after you box in your whole numbers, right, we're going to start by labeling the top of our number line. So we're going to label the fifths. And we're going to start at 0. What fraction are we going to write above the 0 line when we're counting by fifths? That's right, 0 fifths. And we're on a number line, so we're counting up. So the next fraction will be 1/5, then 2/5, then 3/5, then 4/5, and finally 5/5. All right. Now, if you need to pause your video to make sure that the top part of your number line that's partitioned into fifths is labeled correctly, go ahead and do so now. Now, let's go ahead and label the bottom of our number line, which is partitioned into tenths. So we're going to start at 0, and the fraction there would be 0 tenths. And we're on a number line, so we just count up. The next fraction would be 1/10, then 2/10, then 3/10, then 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10, 8/10, 9/10, and then when you get to 1, underneath the number 1, you're going to write 10/10, because 10/10 is the same as 1 whole, just like 5/5 is the same as 1 whole, which means 5/5 and 10/10 would be equal because they both equal 1 whole. So those are actually equivalent fractions because they equal the same thing. All right, now let's go ahead and plot our points on our number line. And we're plotting our points at the fractions that we're comparing. So we're comparing 4/5, so I'm going to put a dot at 4/5, or you can circle 4/5 if that's easier for you. And I'm going to plot a point or put a dot at 4/10. Now remember, if it's close to 0, it's small. If it's far from 0, it's big. So let's look at our fractions. 4/5. Is 4/5 far from 0 or close to 0? That's right. It's far from 0. And 4/10. It's closer to 0, right? Right. So we're going to write close to 0. So underneath 4/5, you need to write far from 0. And underneath 4/10, you need to write close to 0. Now remember, if it's far from 0, it's the bigger number. If it's close to 0, it's the smaller number. So that means that 4/5 is greater than 4/10. Now, if you need to pause your video to make sure that you have everything on your paper that I have on my screen, go ahead and do so now. Let's take a look at number 5. We're comparing 8/6 and 5/3. Yet again, we have fractions that are equivalent or could be equivalent. Look at the denominators, 6 and 3. Sixths are half of thirds, and you'll see what I'm talking about when we partition our number line. So we're going to partition the top of our number line into sixths and the bottom of our number line into thirds. So let's go ahead and partition the top of our number line into sixths. And again, using 2 different colors will be very, very helpful so that you can see the difference. So let's put our first line right about here. Second line is going to go about there. Our third line's going to be kind of in the middle, right? Our fourth line is going to go about here. Our fifth line is going to go here. And our sixth line is going to be right there on the top of the 2. That's the whole. Now, we're going to partition the bottom of our number line into thirds. And I've already placed my first line there. Notice how my first line is directly under the second sixth. That means that they're the same. They're equal. So there's my first line for my thirds. Here's my second line for my thirds. And my third line is going to be directly on the whole number 2. Directly there. Now, just like before, I want you to box in your whole numbers. Now, notice this number line doesn't start with 0. It starts with the number 1, and it ends with the number 2, which means our beginning fraction is going to look a little different. The numerator of the fraction that we start with is not going to be a 0. We have to figure out what fraction is equivalent or equal to 1 whole. Now, the top of our number line is partitioned into sixths. How many sixths equals 1 whole? Well, if you said 6, you're absolutely correct. So the fraction that we're going to start with at the top of our number line is 6 sixths, because 6 sixths equals 1 whole. Now again, we're on a number line, so we just count up. So since we're starting with 6 sixths, our next fraction is going to be 7 sixths, then 8 sixths, then 9 sixths, then 10 sixths. Next would be 11 sixths, and finally 12 sixths. Now, I know that 12 sixths is the correct fraction to have above the number 2 because 12 divided by 6 is 2. That's how I can check my math to make sure that my fractions are in the correct locations above my whole numbers. And the same with the whole number 1. 6 divided by 6 is 1. So I know that 6 sixths is the correct fraction to have above the number 1. Now, if you need to pause your video to make sure that your number line looks like my number line so far, go ahead and do so now. Okay, now let's label the bottom of our number line, which should be easy because it's partitioned into thirds, so it's not as much labeling. Now, how many thirds is equivalent or equal to 1 whole? I'll give you a hint. It should look kind of like the sixths, except for it should be threes because we're partitioning into thirds. Right. If you said 3/3, you're absolutely correct. 3/3 is equivalent or equal to 1 whole because 3 divided by 3 equals 1. Now, remember, we're on a number line, so we just count up. We start with 3/3, so the next fraction would be 4/3. Then 5/3. And finally, 6/3 goes directly below the number 2. I know that that fraction is correct because 6 divided by 3 is 2. Now, let's go ahead and plot our fractions on our number line. So, first I want to plot the fraction 8 sixths. Now, I'm going to put a dot there, but you can circle it. And next I'm going to plot 5/3. I'm going to put a dot there. So you should either have 8 sixths circled or have a dot underneath 8 sixths. And you should have 5/3 circled or have a dot on 5/3. Now, if you need to pause your video right now to make sure that you have everything on your paper that I have on my screen, go ahead and do so now. All right, now let's compare these two fractions. Now let's look at 8 sixths. Is 8 sixths in comparison to 5/3, is 8 sixths close to 1? Right? Because we can't say close to 0 because 1 is the smallest whole, okay? So is it close to 1 or far from 1? That's right. 8/6 is close to 1. And what about 5/3? If 8/6 is closest to 1, then that means that 5/3 is farthest from 1. All right, now, the closest it is to the smallest whole number, which will be 1, that means it's small. The farther it is from that number, that means that the fraction is larger. So we know that 0 would be on the end where 1 is. So that still has the same rule, right? So it would be closest to 0 or closest to 1, and that would make it small. Far from 0 or far from 1 would make it big. Okay? So since 8/6 is closest to 1, which means it's closest to 0, then that means that that is the smaller fraction. So we will put the symbol in there, less than. 8/6 is less than 5/3. Now, if you need to pause your video to make sure that you have everything on your paper that I have on my screen, go ahead and do so now. Now let's go ahead and take a look at number 6. Number 6 says Liz and Jay each have a piece of string. Liz's string is 4/6 yards long, and Jay's string is 5/7 yard long. Whose string is longer? Draw a number line to model the length of both strings. Explain the comparison using pictures, numbers, and words. Okay, so let's take this sentence by sentence as we always do with the word problem. Liz and Jay each have a piece of string. Liz's string is 4/6 yards long and Jay's string is 5/7 yards long. Okay, so to represent the string, and I see that I have fractions, so I know that it's a lot easier to draw a fraction strip and then turn that fraction strip into a number line. So let's go ahead and draw a fraction strip, right? And then we're going to turn that fraction strip into a number line. So they have to be the exact same size, same length, because we have to compare them correctly. So let's draw Liz's string, and we're using a rectangle to represent that. And then we're going to draw Jay's string. Same size, same length rectangle. Now, again, we can turn fraction strips into number lines. Just have to add a couple of things. So make sure you have your 2 rectangles on your paper, and then we're going to turn these fraction strips into number lines. Okay, so first, let's work on Liz's piece of string. In order to turn this to a number line, we're going to add another little line and write a 0 and box it in on one end. Then to the opposite end, add a little line and box in the number 1. Because this is one whole piece of string, 1. So I have officially turned my fraction strip into a number line. Now I need to partition it. So Liz's string is in sixths, right? So I'm going to use, just like a number line, 6 lines to make sure that I have it partitioned correctly so that when I label it, it's labeled correctly. So let's place our first line right about here, okay? And our second line, line 3 should be in the middle. Line 4, line 5, and line 6 should be directly on your whole number. In this case, it's the number 1, because now that means we have a whole number line, a whole fraction strip. All right. Now, let's label it. Make sure you have your lines Make sure it looks like mine. And we're going to start labeling. So we start at 0. And we're going to write 0/6 right below the number 0 that you have boxed in. And it's a number line, of course, so we're going to count up. So after 0/6, it's 1/6, then 2/6, then 3/6, then 4/6, then 5/6, and finally 6/6 would be directly below the number 1 because 6/6 is the same thing as 1 whole. And also I know that 6 divided by 6 is 1. So that fraction is definitely in the correct location. Now, Liz's string is 4/6 yards, right? So I'm going to put a dot right there above 4/6. Now you can circle it instead of putting a dot there. It's completely up to you. That's fine. If you want to circle 4/6 instead of putting a dot above it, that's fine. Now, if you need to at this point pause your video to make sure that your paper looks like my screen, go ahead and do so now. All right, now we've completed the diagram or model of Liz's string. Now we have to complete a model of Jay's string. Now Jay's string is 5/7 yards long. So that means that we have to partition Jay's string into sevenths. So we have to turn our fraction strip into a number line. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to make a little line right here. And then we're going to write the number 0 and box it in. Do that on this end, right? And then on the opposite end, we're going to draw a little line there. And we're going to write the number 1 and box it in. Now that we have our endpoints of 0 and 1, because it's a whole string, one whole string, we're going to partition it into sevenths. So we need 7 lines. Now let's go ahead and start partitioning this fraction strip into sevenths. Put a line right here, like right before the 1/6 line, right? Okay, and our second line will go about here. Line 3 would be about right here. Line 4 would be here. Line 5 would go about right here. Line 6 would be about right here. And line 7 would go directly on top of 1 whole. Now notice sevenths are a little smaller than sixths. And that's how it should be. Remember, the larger the denominator, the smaller the pieces. So sevenths should be smaller than sixths. All right, now let's plot 5/7 after we label it. So we need to go ahead and label our number line. And we're going to start with 0. 0/7, right? And it's a number line. It was a fraction strip, but we turned it into a number line. So we're counting up. So after 0/7 would be what? That's right, 1/7. And we just keep counting up. So after 1/7 would be 2/7, 3/7, 4/7, 5/7, 6/7, 7/7. Okay, so we have 7/7. Now, 7/7 is the same as 1 whole because as we know, 7 divided by 7 equals 1. So I know that all of my fractions are in the correct place on our number line. Now we can plot 5/7. So I'm going to put a dot right there above 5/7, but you can circle it if that's easier for you to do. Now let's take a look. Remember, when a fraction is closer to 0, it's smaller. When it's farther from 0, It's bigger, right? Because it's closer to 1. So looking at 4/6, right? Is 4/6 closer to 0 than 5/7? Yes. 4/6 is closer to 0 than 5/7 is, which means 5/7 is far from 0. So since 4/6 is close to 0, that means that it's the smaller fraction. So right here, I'm going to write my comparison. I'm going to explain my comparison. So I'm going to write 4/6 yards is less than 5/7 yards. Now, if you need to pause your video to make sure that everything on my screen is on your paper, go ahead and do so now. Now let's take a look at number 7. Number 7 says, in a long jump competition, Wendy jumped 9/10 meters and Judy jumped 10/9 meters. Draw a number line to model the distance of each girl's long jump. Who jumped the shorter distance? Explain how you know using pictures, numbers, and words. Okay, that means I need a model of tenths and a model of ninths. So let's start with Wendy's model, okay? Wendy's model is in tenths. Now, just like with the last question, our models need to be the same size. So in order to compare them, they need to look the same. They need to start out looking the same. So I'm going to draw a big rectangle for Wendy and a big rectangle for Judy. Okay? One for Wendy, one for Judy. Okay. Now, Wendy's fraction strip needs to be partitioned into tenths. So first I have to turn Wendy's fraction strip into a number line. So the same way we turn the other fraction strips into number lines, we're going to do the same thing here. So I'm going to place a little line here and write the number 0 and box it in. And that's my first end point. And on my opposite end, I'm going to write another little line, write the number 1 and box it in. So I have my endpoints, 0 at one end and 1 at the other end. So my number line is going from 0 to 1, one whole. This is one whole number line. All right, now I need 10 lines because I need to partition it into tenths. So let's go ahead and start partitioning. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and my 10th line should be directly on that whole number. Every 10 lines is a whole number. If I have to go past that 10th line, then that's starting another whole. Okay, so this is a whole number, one whole. Now let's go ahead and label our tenths. We're going to start with 0. So underneath 0 should be 0/10. And we're going to count up because now it's a number line. We've transformed this lowly fraction strip into a beautiful number line. Beautiful swan. Okay, so after 0/10, it's 1/10, then 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10, 8/10, 9/10, And 10 tenths is the same thing as 1 whole, because 10 divided by 10 is 1. Okay, now that our number line for Wendy has been correctly labeled and partitioned into tenths, let's go ahead and plot 9 tenths, because that's where Wendy jumped. She jumped to 9 tenths meters. Now, I placed a dot there. You can circle it. If circling it is easy for you, then that's what you do. All right. Now we need to go ahead and turn Judy's fraction strip into a number line. So first, we draw a little line here, end point of 0, and box it in. And on the opposite end, we draw a little line there and write the end point of 1 and box it in. Now we have the end point of 0 and 1. Now we need to partition this number line into ninths, which means we need 9 lines. So let's go ahead and partition it into ninths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 directly on that whole number, because 9 ninths is 1 whole. All right, now we need to label our number line. So we're starting at 0, which means our first fraction is going to be 0 ninths. Oh, but wait a minute. I just had to put another one there. Why? Why? Look at the question. It said Judy jumped 10 ninth meters. Well, if I stopped at 1, right? If I stop at 9 ninths, then I won't have enough ninths to represent Judy's jump. So I had to add another ninth so that I could have 10 ninths. So add another little square. And we need that square so that we can represent the word problem correctly. Now we can start labeling. So at 0, below 0, we're going to write 0 ninths. And again, this is a number line after all, so we're just counting up. After 0 ninths is 1 ninth, 2 ninths, 3 ninths, 4 ninths, 5 ninths, 6 ninths, 7 ninths, 8 ninths, 9 ninths should be directly below the number 1, because 9 divided by 9 is 1, which means 9 ninths is equivalent or equal to 1. And then that extra little square that we added, that extra ninth we added, that's 10 ninths. And we had to do that so that we could correctly represent Judy's jump, because Judy jumped 10 ninths. So Judy jumped over 1 whole. She jumped more than 1 whole. She jumped more than a whole meter. All right, so we go ahead and plot where Judy jumped to. Judy jumped right there. And if you want to circle it, you can go ahead and circle it. And now let's take a look at it so that we can compare, right? Now, look at Wendy's model. Is Wendy closer to 0 than Judy is? Yeah, She's closer to 0. So that means that Judy is farther from 0. So that means that Wendy jumped the shorter distance. So when I write out my comparison at the bottom of the screen here, I'm going to write 9/10 meters is less than 10/9 meters. Now, if you need to pause your video to make sure that you have everything on your paper that I have on my screen, go ahead and do so now. Okay, now let's take a look at number 8. Number 8 says, Nikki has 3 pieces of yarn. The first piece is 5/6 feet long. The second piece is 5/3 feet long. And the third piece is 3/2 feet long. She wants to arrange them from the shortest to the longest. Draw a number line to model the length of each piece of yarn. Write a number sentence using less than, greater than, or equal to compare the pieces. Explain using pictures, numbers, and words. Let's go ahead and model these pieces of string. Now, I'm going to ask that you draw 2 rectangles to represent each piece of string. So this would be the first piece of string. All right, now we're going to draw 2 rectangles again to represent the second piece of string. And for the third piece of string, we're going to do the same thing. 2 rectangles to represent the third piece of string. Now, why are we drawing 2 rectangles to represent each piece of string? Well, we have to because a couple of these measurements are bigger than a whole number. Look at 5/3. I know that 3/3 is a whole, but because that's 5/3, I know that it's a little longer than 1 whole. The same with 3/2. I know that 2/2 is a whole, but since that's 3/2, I know that's going to be a little longer than 1 whole. So I'm making 2 wholes. 2 wholes is going to make up each piece of string or yarn. Now let's start partitioning. The first piece is 5/6, which means I need to partition each one of my whole rectangles into sixths. All right, so let's go ahead and partition my 2 rectangles that represent my first piece of yarn into sixths. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the 6th line is in the middle, right? Then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and my 6th line is on the end. All right. So you should have to draw 5 lines in each rectangle. 5 lines in each rectangle. And if you count your sections, you should have 6 sections in each rectangle. And if you need to pause your video, go ahead and do so now to make sure that both of your rectangles that are connected are partitioned into 6 pieces each. You should have 12 total pieces. All right, let's go ahead and label our model of 6. So that's going to be 1/6. And I'm going to count up. I'm pretending this is a number line because it's easier to do it like that. Okay, so we're going to pretend this is a number line, and we're going to officially turn it into a number line at the end. But let's go ahead and label each section counting up like we're counting on a number line, okay? So 1/6. This would be 2/6. So you're going to write inside of each section, just like we're writing on a number line. 3/6. then what will be next? That's right. 4/6, 5/6, 6/6, 7/6, 8/6, 9/6, 10/6, 11/6, 12/6. So if you need to pause your video right now to make sure that you have each little section of your fraction strip / number line labeled, go ahead and do so now. All right, now we're going to label our second model, which is supposed to represent our second piece of yarn. And that piece of yarn is going to be partitioned into thirds because the second piece is 5/3 feet long. So we need one line here, one line here, and we have 3 pieces. It's in thirds. And we're going to do the same thing to the rectangle that's connected to it. One line here and another line here. All right, now they're fraction strips. At the end, we're going to make them into official number lines. Just stick with me here, okay? Because fraction strips can be used as number lines. All right, so now that it's partitioned correctly, let's go ahead and label it. We're going to do it the exact same way that we did the number line / fraction strip of 6. So in our first section, we're going to place 1/3 there, right? 1/3 in the first section. 2/3 in the second section. 3/3 in the third section. What do you think we're going to write in the fourth section? That's right, 4/3. Still counting up because we're treating it like a number line. 5/3. And in the final section, 6/3. All right. Now, if you need to pause your video to make sure that you have the second string partitioned into thirds correctly and also labeled correctly for when we turn it into a number line, go ahead and do so now. Now, our third piece of yarn is supposed to be 3/2, which means we have to partition these 2 rectangles into halves. So let's just draw a line in the middle of each one. Just like that. And now we're going to label our halves. Treating it like a number line, we're just going to count up. So in the very first section, we're going to label that as 1/2. The second section, we're going to label that as 2/2. Treating it like a number line, so we're counting up. After 2/2 would be 3/2. And after 3/2 would be 4/2. Now, at this point, all 3 of your pieces of yarn should be labeled. All 3 pieces of yarn should be labeled. And if you need to pause your video to make sure that your paper looks like my screen, go ahead and do so now. Perfect. Now let's find our fractions that we're comparing. So it says the first piece is 5/6 long. So I'm going to find 5/6 and circle it. Then it says the second piece is 5/3 long. So on my second model, which is my second piece of yarn, I'm going to find 5/3 and circle it. Then it says the third piece is 3/2 long. So on my third piece, I'm going to find 3/2 and circle it. Now remember, I promised you that these fraction strips were going to turn into number lines, right? Let's turn them into number lines. First thing I'm going to do is draw a straight line right here, all the way down. Now remember, your rectangle should have been around the same size so that you can draw a line straight down just like I did here. And directly beneath that line, I'm going to write a 0 and box it in. Now, in the middle, I'm going to draw another line straight down right here. So in your first model, it should be between 6, 6, and 7, 6. In your second model, that line should be between 3/3 and 4/3. And in your third model, that line should be between 2/2 and 3/2. Straight down. And I'm going to write the number 1 and box it in. And at the very end of the models, I'm going to draw one more line straight down. And at the bottom of that line, I'm going to write the number 2 and box it in. Now, why do we do that? Because I'm showing you where we start our number line at 0 and where we end our number line at 2. Now take a look. See how 6/2, 3/3, and 2/2 are right there at one hole? Do you see how 12/6, 6/3, and 4/2 is right there at 2? All of them equal 2. 12 divided by 6 is 2. 6 divided by 3 is 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. If your models look like mine, then that means that you partitioned them and labeled them correctly. So make sure your paper looks like my screen. And if you need to pause the video right now to make sure that it does, go ahead and do so now. Okay, now we are moving on to make our list because we were supposed to also list these models of these pieces of yarn from shortest to longest. All right, so which fraction is closest to 0? I'm going to write list from shortest to longest. Which fraction is closest to 0? Look at the ones you circled. If you said 5/6, then you're absolutely correct. So 5/6 should be the very first fraction in your list from shortest to longest. Okay, what fraction would be next? Now that 5/6 is out of the way, which fraction is closest to 0 now? If you said 3/2, you're absolutely correct. Perfect. 3/2. So that means that 5/3 is the longest piece of yarn, or the biggest fraction in this case. Now, if you need to pause your video to make sure that you have everything on your paper that I have on my screen, go ahead and do so now. Congratulations! Lesson 19 homework is complete. As always, I hope this video has helped you to complete your homework correctly and to understand Lesson 19 a little bit better. I hope you have a great rest of your day or evening whenever you're watching this video. And make sure to always check your work so that your math will always be mathing. Well, this is Ms. Jones saying bye until next time.